First of all, let me make this clear. I come from a long line of alcoholics. I certainly probably could have gotten some grief counseling, and I refer grief counseling to everybody nowadays, but there was no such thing in those days, nothing. We don't get anything unless we take it away from somebody. Every one of our cases is taking something away that somebody wants to fight with you about, almost always money.
Welcome to Celebrating Justice, presented by the Trial Lawyers Journal and Cloudlex, the next-gen legal cloud platform built exclusively for personal injury law. Get inspired by the nation's top trial lawyers and share in the stories that shape our pursuit of justice. Follow the podcast and join our community at triallawyersjournal.com. Now here's your host, editor of TLJ and VP of Marketing at Cloudlex, Chad Sands.
Welcome back to Celebrating Justice. In the Season 2 premiere episode, we welcome Gary Gwilliam, the author of the book, Getting a Winning Verdict in My Personal Life, A Trial Lawyer Finds His Soul. Gary has a lot of stories to share after over 180 jury trials, from opening up about substance abuse to talking about profound losses, both inside and outside the courtroom. When it comes to giving back to other lawyers and his clients, Gary holds nothing back. To get to the answers about dealing with aging, getting sober, and finding your soul, I asked him, why did you want to become a trial lawyer?
Well, let me tell you how I became a lawyer. I was a hard-drinking guy at Pomona College. I was in a hard-drinking fraternity. As a matter of fact, I had a guy that became very famous. It was a fraternity brother of mine named Chris Christopherson. And Chris and I were hard-drinking guys. And nobody in my family had gone to college, let alone law school. But I was finishing up my year, and I was having a lot of fun. And I'd done some sales. And as a matter of fact, if you read my book, I'd been a gang member. I'd found my way finally to Pomona College after getting kicked out of high school for drinking and stealing cars and doing stuff that a lot of lawyers didn't do. So we had a fraternity advisor who was the philosophy professor. His name was Fred Sontag, very well-known guy. And he got to know us all very well. And he came to me in my senior year, and it was early in my senior year, and he came to me and he says, Gary, he says, have you thought about what you want to do when you get out? And I said, Fred, I don't know. I think I'll probably get an MBA, master's in business. I don't know. I'm just going to go on, and hadn't really thought about it. Well, he says, have you ever thought about being a lawyer? And do you know what came to mind? Nothing. It was like this blank over my head. I'd never known a lawyer. There were no lawyers. This was 1959. I mean, this is a hell of a long time ago. And all of a sudden I said, wow, a lawyer. So I blasted off some applications. I got Yale dumped me, but I got accepted to Harvard, turned them down, went to Berkeley Law, hated law school for 3 years. And then when I started my career in the DA's office, I loved it. And I tell you, Chad, I'm one of these guys that found the right career. I could not be anything but a lawyer in this life. I can go into reasons for that they're a little esoteric, but it has absolutely been a perfect career for me. And from the day I started practicing law till today, all these 60 plus years later, I have loved being a lawyer and a trial lawyer. I needed to be a trial lawyer. I didn't want to be a business lawyer, and I didn't want to write contracts. I wanted to be out there trying cases. And I've tried 180 jury trials to verdict. I've tried about 40 of them were criminal cases, and the rest were civil cases. I've had a wonderful, very interesting career.
You were drinking beers, probably jamming a little bit with Chris Christopherson back in the frat, but maybe go to law school for 3 more years to keep the drinking and partying going a little?
Well, that was part of it a little bit, but I really was kind of floating because I didn't really have any role models about where I was going to go. The Fred Sontag sent me in that direction. He's gone now. He was always a mentor of mine, and I was always very thankful that I was able to find the career I wanted.
And you started at the DA's office, though?
Yeah, I started in the Ventura DA's office. At the time, it was the fastest growing county in California. There was a big spillover from Los Angeles. So I ended up trying a lot of cases. I was there a little less than 4 years, and I moved up from just being a trial lawyer to the number 3 guy in the DA's office. I was the chief trial deputy. I got involved in a death penalty case. I was assigning all the felony cases, tried some heavy cases. I thought very seriously about being a career as a prosecutor because I really liked what I did. But my wife wanted to move out. We had lost a set of quadruplets, which was a very sad thing for us. And so we kind of wanted to move. She wanted to move back to Berkeley, where I'd gone to law school. And so when we came back up here, I was fortunate enough to run into one of my professors at Berkeley Law, Bolt Hall, they called it at the time. And he referred me to what was the biggest and best personal injury firm in Oakland. And I just happened to be at the right time at the right place. And when I went in there, they offered me a job. And they said, well, how much money do you want? And I said, well, probably can't make this amount of money because I just got a really good raise at the DA's office. I'm making $1,100 a month, but I wouldn't expect that much from you, probably $1,000. They said, we're going to give you $1,200. I said, wow, what a deal, $1,200 a month. I'm a rich man. So I started off, and then they just had me a bunch of cases, and I started trying a bunch of the chicken shit little cases, rear end accidents and every kind of thing. And in the DA's office, I'd won 20 cases in a row, and I was hot. And then when I got there, I had trouble with my first 5 cases. And the difference was, in the DA's office, I didn't have a client. I had the people as my client. And I had to learn how to deal with clients and do something a little different than I could. So once I got through the first 5 cases, I was on a roll, and I started trying cases. And in those years, we were trying cases like once a month. I tried 10 jury trials in a year, and that was just unheard of nowadays. But I was just rolling them and having fun and hard drinking, and I loved the mystique of the whole thing. Even at our board meetings, we'd open up the bar at 11 o'clock, and we'd a Bloody Mary or whatever you wanted. So those were the days, but unfortunately, you burn out with that kind of lifestyle, and that's what kind of happened to me.
So you did quickly mention it, and I did a little bit of research and heard about the loss of your quadruplets.
There was a time in the 60s when we were doing this that you just didn't talk about this. Nowadays, everybody talks about fertility issues, and they're very open. But at that time, it was embarrassing. Although at that time, 1 in 6 people, 16%, were having problems. Now it's way up to 25%, and frankly, probably even more. A lot of it is stress issues and other things. There's a lot of problems with people having trouble. So ultimately, it was a very difficult time, and there were three girls and 1 boy. Ultimately, I ended up with 3 girls. I never did have another boy. He was the only one I ever lost. But when I went into my second marriage, my second wife had also had fertility problems, interestingly enough. It was something that kind of held us together. We said, we're never going to go through this fertility stuff again. We're going to adopt. So we ended up adopting 2 wonderful girls in the 70s and had great times with them.
It seems like such a loss.
Here's the deal, Chad. At the time, I certainly probably could have gotten some grief counseling, and I refer grief counseling to everybody nowadays, but there was no such thing in those days, nothing. And I'm a trial lawyer, so I'll tell you the story. When we realized that she had 4 fetuses, it was too late because the babies were so big in there, they were ready to come out, even though they were very small. So when they came out, they were between a pound 9 and a little less than that. I think the youngest, the boy was a pound 9. And there had never been fetuses survive that. Nowadays they have. It was the first set of quadruplets born in Ventura County. They'd never had a set there. And so they didn't know what to do with them. So when she lost them, we knew that we would not be able to do it. And it was very sad. She was in there, and I went in, and the little boy was in an isolette. In my book, I talk about the fact that I walked up and I looked in there, and he's in this little teeny creature is just struggling for breath. And I'm looking at this little thing, and I'm saying, that's my son. And it turns out that that's the only son I'll ever have. And here's what I did to deal with it. I work and I drank. I went home, opened up the scotch bottle, drank it, went to work the next day, drank the next night, and I did just what I'd always done. And that was the way I dealt with it. That's not the appropriate way. Now you need some counseling and talk about it. But ultimately, it broke our marriage up. I mean, our marriage was probably on the rocks anyway, but one of those life-changing events that happened. But it turned out for the best because, later on I had 2 wonderful adopted kids. I was fortunate to get them because adoptions were getting very difficult in the early 70s because people were beginning to keep their children. There was more fertility issues. The people, birth control. So at one time, there was just a lot of adopted kids out there in the 50s, maybe even in the early 60s. But by the time the 70s, the adoption market had dried up, and people were adopting kids from other countries, from Korea and China and wherever around the world,
Was the loss, do you think that pushed you into the deep end in terms of your drinking?
No, not exactly. First of all, let me make this clear. I come from a long line of alcoholics. My father was an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic. My uncle was an alcoholic. And I knew perfectly well, the statistics were that I was 11 times more likely to become an alcoholic than others. I was aware of that, but I knew that I wouldn't become an alcoholic because I was smarter than all my parents and my grandparents. They hadn't even gone to college, let alone law school. Here, how smart am I am? Well, that was arrogant as hell. Of course, that's just not true. What happened to me is what happened to so many trial lawyers, and it shaped the way that I have dealt with lawyers. And at some stage, I started trying these cases. When I moved up to Oakland, and it was case after case after case. And the stress began to get to me, and I'd gotten into my second marriage and had new kids, and there were stresses of that. And then ultimately, I left my old firm and had to form my own firm, and that added to the stress. So I know exactly in my life, and I think so many of us do, when do you turn from a social drinker to a problem drinker? And the time for me was this. It was because at the end of the day, I always loved having a drink before dinner, and I'd go out and need a drink. So I wanted a drink. But there came a time when I needed a drink. Drink became something that I really had to have. And I'd go into the bar and have a couple of pops before I went home. Then I'd start drinking at home. I was a functional alcoholic. I was still able to work, but I was more and more getting into it. But it was directly related to the stress in my life. So I wasn't drinking for fun anymore. I was drinking for stress. I've given a talk to lawyers once in a while that says, am I drinking too much is a rhetorical question. Well, rhetorical questions answer themselves. They love it. Well, of course you are. And I think that if people really begin to say, am I reaching the point where I really need a drink as opposed to just want a drink, that's when you got to be careful about whether you're turning that corner. There's a whole subject of whether you really go down the drain and how far you really need to get into rehab and Alcoholics Anonymous and maybe even getting into rehab facilities. But I'm interested in that turning point for us because there's so much abuse of alcohol in our profession. We're probably the worst profession, maybe along with the medical profession and some of the cops. We're one of the worst professions for alcoholism, depression, suicide, stress. And here's what it's about, if you don't mind my saying, particularly trial lawyers. We don't get anything unless we take it away from somebody. Every one of our cases is taking something away that somebody wants to fight with you about, almost always money. Big people, and we're taking on big companies and big insurance companies. And look at who Brian Chase, my friend, has taken on. General Motors, Ford, people that do not want to do that. So we're always in this fight mode. It's fight and flight, and that leads to a lot of stress. I mean, we don't make our money easily. We can make big money when we get it right, but we can also get crunched if you lose a big case. I've known lawyers who've seen a really bad case and a loss that's ruined their career. They got so wrapped up in trying to win their cases that the stress got to them. It's sad to see that happen, but we have to be aware that we're in a very stressful profession. And that's what I've tried to teach my fellow trial lawyers is be aware of this. Let's be careful of these, because if I can save another trial lawyer, look at all the people I'm saving besides just my own clients. And I know that I've helped other people because they've come up and told me that. And I'm very proud of the fact that I've helped other lawyers, other trial lawyers who have helped their clients. So everything that you're doing with the good work you're doing with all the people you're interviewing, I would like to think that I'm helping my fellow trial lawyers be able to help their clients,
You mentioned this idea of a turning point.
Right.
Can you talk about your turning point and how you recognized it and what you did?
Yeah. I'll tell you the story. In my second marriage, I had adopted these two kids, and life was really good for a while. But then I began drinking harder, and I began partying a little bit more than I should have, and I was out late when I should have been doing things. I'm going to be honest with you. I was not as good a husband as I should be, all the stress and the drinking. And my second marriage began to fall apart. I knew my wife was getting ready to leave me, and my kids at that time were 9 and 11. And I loved my wife, and I didn't want her to leave me, but I knew that I needed to make some changes. But the problem I had, Chad, at this point in my life, everything I'd ever done that I enjoyed was with alcohol. I was a Raiders fan. How the hell could I go to a Raider game and not drink Oakland Raiders and drink beer? How could I go out and play cards or dominoes with my buddies? How could I go to a party and not drink? And every fun thing I'd ever done my whole life had been involved with drinking. And I was afraid if I stopped drinking, I would not have fun anymore. I wouldn't do it. And the date was June 11th, 1984. I'll never forget the date. It was a Saturday night, and my wife said to me, hey, we're going to go down and meet the Potters, who are drinking friends of ours. And she says, we're going to meet them 5:30 and a little early. And I said, oh, it was Saturday night. Okay, well, let's do it. So we walked into the place, and I turned to right to go in the bar, and she says, no, we're meeting them in the coffee shop. And I said, coffee shop? The what? Potters? And then she guided me in. I walked in. The coffee shop was almost deserted, except over in the corner were four guys, and she guided me over there. And I said, hell, one of my former partners was there, and a guy named Ed Caldwell. I thought he was a hard drinking guy. And then there was also one guy that I didn't know. So I'm getting very suspicious about this. Liz says, these guys want to talk to you about drinking. And I said, Jesus, good. I'd love to talk about drinking. Let's go in the bar and talk about drinking, But it turned out that I had one of the very early interventions. And so they sat me down and with Liz and my wife, and they were very honest. They said, Gary, look, your partners are worried about you. You're drinking. We know that you're passing out sometimes, and you've got to stop this. And I sat there for a while. And finally, I turned to him, and I turned to one of the guys, and I said, are you getting better verdicts than I am? What the hell right do you have to tell me who the hell whether I'm drinking or not? Go F yourself. And I took Liz, and I said, I'm done with this thing. And I walked out, and we walked out in stony silence, and, you lied to me. We're not meeting the Potters. She didn't say anything. So we drove home in stony silence. And when I got home, talk about arrogance, I turned to my wife and I said, well, you don't expect me not to have a drink after that, do you? Like poor Gary deserves a drink after my intervention. But I went in and I poured a drink, and my wife was crying in the other room, and I knew that my marriage was either over or not. And I finished my scotch and soda. And I started to pick another one up, and it didn't taste very good. And I turned around, and I said, I've got to make a choice. And I walked back into her room, and I said, Liz, I'm going to tell you something I've never said I'm going to quit drinking. I've never gone on the wagon, never did that. But I'm going to stop right now today because I don't want you to leave me, and I love you, and I love my kids. And I know it was arrogance. And Chad, I felt in that whole intervention like somebody had slapped me right across the face. It had forced me to deal with my own ego and arrogance. And I stopped. I stopped that very day. And we fortunately had a nice trip planned to Hawaii. And then we came back. The problem I had after I came back was I'm the life of the party. I'm a guy that told jokes. I would have a little joke book. I'd get half in the bag, and I couldn't remember my jokes. I'd go into the John, tell him I was taking a leak, and I'd get my little book out and remember my jokes, go back out. People love me. And I go to the party, and I said, well, I'm not going to be the life of the party anymore. So I go in there, and I said, what are people going to think when Gary Gwilliam is not drinking? And I go in, and I order a soda and with a little lime in it. Nobody says anything. I realized nobody gives a damn what they're only caring about what they drinking. I care about what I'm drinking. But my life dramatically changed. Although I slipped a little bit, and that's another story. For the most part, that was the end of my drinking. And then my friend Ed Caldwell that was in there that started the other bar. The other bar is a local offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous, only for lawyers and judges and people in the legal committee. And he saved so many lives, and he saved my life. He's gone now, but oh God, I loved Ed. And Ed saved my life. I mean, if I hadn't quit drinking then, Chad, I was going to die. My liver was going out. My triglycerides were out. I was 47 years old, and everything changed the day I quit drinking.
How did you find the ability to still have fun without drinking that you were so afraid of?
Well, what happened is I'd go to these parties, and at the end of the day, I can still remember them. Because the old days when I was half in the bag, I couldn't remember. It was a different thing. And I realized, you don't have to be the funny guy in the life of the party. I enjoyed more serious conversations. I would entertain people in a different kind of way and kind of get to know people and talk about serious stuff. And when I quit drinking, I went on an entirely different spiritual search. The subtitle in my book is A Trial Lawyer Finds His Soul. I really went into a deep dive to find out not only why I quit drinking, because why was I drinking, but I needed to answer a more fundamental question, that is, who am I? What is the purpose of my life? What happens to me when I die? Have I lived other lives? Questions like this. I found in the year or two after I quit drinking was a very profound time. And I really found my answer. I found it. My mother died about the same time that I became president of the trial lawyers. And I connected with her soul and did a lot of really deep work in order to find the purpose of my life. Each of us have to find our own way. Chad, you got to find your way. You're a young guy. But I found my way. And I feel very comfortable with it. I feel very comfortable about it. I know when I'm going to die. I'm going to die when my time is up, when I've completed what I've got to done. And it's not today. I still have work to do even at this late stage. But quitting drinking was just part of a long journey that took me in an entirely different direction. And I'm a very different person than I was when I was back drinking. It's like two separate lives, really.
Getting a winning verdict. In my personal life, a trial lawyer finds his soul is the name of your book.
Correct.
Can you tell me a little bit about the journey of what it was like to find your soul?
Well, it was like I say, because my biological father, and I lived with him when I was out of high school and trying to get my way after I'd become a gang member. I had a falling out with him, and he tried to force me into going to Alcoholics Anonymous when I was 19 years old, and I wasn't ready. So I did not want to go into AA myself, and I didn't. I wanted to find my own way, and so I felt that I needed to go to what AA people now call it the 12th step. There's a series of steps that you go through in the Alcoholics Anonymous, and the 12th step is finding your own soul and journey. And so I needed to do it, and I started looking around for alternative ways and started reading a whole bunch of different literature. And I looked into Buddhism, I looked into spirituality, I looked into past lives, and I found some stuff that was just made sense to me. And ultimately, I found a hypnotherapist that was absolutely terrific. And she took me into some deep places, and I found this channeling and connected with some things that are very interesting to me. And it was a place for me that made sense for me to realize that each of us has to find our own way. Some people can find it through traditional religion, going to churches. That's not me. I come from a long line of Mormons. So that's another weird thing in my life is that I escaped to Mormonism because I was born in Utah. And at that, I did not want to go back to Mormonism. I wasn't going there. And I didn't want to go into Catholicism or anything. So I just needed to read the books and do the work. And I found what I needed to find. And very fortunate that I made that journey. A lot of people have made that same journey. We each have to make our own journey here there. So we're getting kind of into deep stuff here, but this is what life's about, in my view.
I like to get into deep stuff with deep people, and podcast is for trial lawyers. But quite honestly, I don't really talk about big verdicts that much. The stories are more interesting.
Right.
One of my favorite books is a book called Henderson the Rain King, which is about this American millionaire who goes to Africa to find his soul. Is how I kind of summarize it. But do you have any advice then maybe for anyone who's at that turning point or anyone who is still letting their ego take over? What can they do to try and find their soul?
I think a lot of us who find that way kind of have to hit bottom a little bit. When I was in my hard drinking days and having fun and chasing women and going out to bars and doing all the stuff we did and winning cases, I was kind of a hedonist and I wasn't ready for that. I had to kind of get slapped in the face and realize that I needed to make some changes. And there comes a time when you realize that drinking isn't good for you. Some people can come to it early. Some people don't, I guess. But there's so many different ways that we can find our own way. But I think what you really need is just to ask yourself the same question. Who am I? In my life, I don't find religion by looking at a human being. I'm not here to dump on people that are Christians and believe in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was a wonderful, very interesting man that people can revere. But I personally just don't believe in worshiping a man. It's the universe and whatever we're a part of is way, way bigger than that. Look into near-death experiences. And you look at these people that have had these NDEs, and they go to the other side, and they have seen something there that is absolutely incredible. There's a curtain we have in life that we can't cross to really see what's out there. And we're very limited in our consciousness. And the NDE experiences are very interesting as to what happens out there. And people don't want to come back and read about meditation, go into a deep place yourself, do hypnotherapy. There's so many different ways you can dig into finding what's deep inside of you, because the answer is inside of us, deeply inside of us, in a very intuitive way. And we can't just figure it out through our left brain,
Yeah. Well, you've been doing this a long time and you've been through a lot. And the second question I do ask is, what makes you unique then as a trial lawyer?
Well, as I said, I've tried a lot of cases and I've tried a wide variety of cases, my criminal cases. But one of the things that I have done is I'm also an employment lawyer and I've tried a bunch of employment cases and I still those. So I think my varied different kinds of trials is important. But I want to just come back again. If I ever have a legacy or somebody to look back on my career, it's not going to be because of all the verdicts that I got. It's going to be because I was helping other lawyers and talking about them. So one of the things that we haven't touched on is I'm one of the few lawyers in the country that's ever talked about their losses. Lawyers never talk about their losses. We go to all these seminars: how to win at this, how to win in voir dire, how to win an opening argument, how to win in cross-examination, win, 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 win. And nobody ever talks about losses. But I'll tell you, you talk to the best trial lawyers around. You ask, do you remember the worst case you've lost? Yes. Right in their mind, they'll always remember that. They might not remember their best wins, but the losses are branded into them. And so what happens is, because we are in a win-win mentality, when all of a sudden we take a bad loss, it can be very difficult for people. So I took a very bad loss on a case. I was the president of the Trial Lawyers Association. It was 1988. And I was in the middle of a lot of things, and I had to try a mid-mount case with my partner. And it was a 5-year statute. It was a tough case. It was a shoulder dystocia case of a girl that ended up with a very shriveled arm. And I'd just beaten a 5-year statute. My young partner at the time, Steve Brewer, was sitting next to me at trial, and I was just examining a witness. Bailiff came in and handed him a phone note at that time. So he looked at this phone note, and he goes over and said, Gary, we got to take a break. And I said, well, I'm just in the middle of, it was at like 10:30, and I said, I'm in the middle of, he says, Gary, take a break right now, please. I said, Your Honor, there's something that's come up. I said, we need to take a break. So we walk into chambers, and the defense attorney's there. He's a nice guy, but a tough guy. And Steve walks in with me, and the judge says, done what it is, and Steve hands me a note, and I look at the note, and it says, your dad called, your mother died this morning. I was really close to my mother, and I'm sitting there in the judge's chambers, started to get emotional and try it up. And so I said, shit, I'm the one son. I said, I got to take a break in this. The judge was a nice guy. He says, all right, well, let's break the case for a week. So I had to go back to Utah and do the whole funeral. And I ended up giving by far the best closing argument I ever did, but it was on my mother's memorial. It wasn't as good as there. So I gave a great talk on my mother, and I went back and tried the case. And to nobody's surprise, I lost the case, and it was a tough case. And so I walked back into my office in the days. It was Saturday morning. I picked up my yellow pad, and I said to myself, is there anything good about this damn case that I just tried? And there are some good things about it. I thought about it. So I was a positive thinker. So I put a line down the side. And I said, on the one side, what are the good things about the loss? What are the bad things? The bad thing is I lost the case. I didn't win any money. Good thing was, my client was very happy. As a matter of fact, she'd worked in our office, and I had a very good relationship with her. And then I learned a lot about how to try a mid-mount case, because I had a really good lawyer on the other side, and I had to appreciate that. And all of a sudden I said, I got to appreciate that, you can lose some cases, you're going to win some cases. So I decided after that to write an article about losing, because I realized nobody had done that. And I looked into Vince Lombardi and Coach Win, Win, Win and everybody. And so I wrote an article called The Art of Losing. And I put it in the American Board of Trial Advocates. I was published in a lot of places, and people had never had an article about losing. But I had a whole series of things about how, when you lose, you get humility. You learn some lessons from losing that are there. And one of them is that we tend to get kind of arrogant. Losing is something that we need to do. We need to have the courage to pick it up again. It gives you courage. You got to get knocked down once in a while to stand up. If there's one thing that I'm really proud of, it's the fact that I had the courage enough to stand up and talk about what happens when they lose cases. And you're not going to have very many trial lawyers that you'll interview that ever want to talk about that subject.
Maybe this was another loss, or maybe it was a win. Maybe it was a big verdict, or maybe it was a little one. I know there's been hundreds over the years for you, but could you share a story about one case that had a significant impact?
Yeah, I'll go back to a case that I tried in 1986, a long time ago. And it was involved a guy that was working on a punch press. And he was a young guy, he was 19 years old, and it was an old press. They were pressing cardboard down to use in wineries, and it was a winery company in this old punch press. And what happened is the punch press came down when his hands were in it, and he had both hands caught, and he had an extremely serious injury, particularly to one hand, but both hands were badly injured, and it was a terrible terrible accident. The case almost got thrown out on the basis that it was a workers' comp case, but I finally got the case to trial and moving on the case. And I was dealing with one of the big-time defense trial lawyers. He'd been trying a lot of cases. His name was Dan McNamara, and he tried 300 jury trials. He was a lot older than I was, but he was a big guy. And so we had been talking about settlement of the case, and we talked for a long time, and we talked about settling it for $1 million, and they weren't going to pay it. They would pay $300,000. Finally, we picked in the jury, my clients there, and we hadn't talked settlement for a couple of weeks, and McNamara comes over and says, well, Gary, he says, I got the $1 million for you, so let's get the case settled. And I said, well, wait a minute, I haven't talked about that. Let me talk to my client. And I said, no, Dan, I'm sorry, we're not going to take it. His jaw dropped open, and he says, you're turning down $1 million? I mean, this is 1986. And I said, we're going to take our chances. So the trial went well, and he wasn't as prepared as I was, but I ended up getting a $5.5 million verdict, which at the time was the biggest hand injury verdict in the country. But much more importantly than the big verdict was the fact that ultimately they paid it off, and it made a big difference to me because I just broken up with my firm, and I was just starting my new firm where we really needed this money to kind of move into a new suite. But more importantly than that, my client became a friend of mine, and years later, I stayed in close touch with him, and when I was into my second marriage, we needed to find a house, and we were moving out here, and this was at least 10, 15 years later, and he was dabbling in real estate and selling it. And it turned out that he had found just the right house for us. So he sold us our house. And at that time, this house was worth $600,000. And that's not much money then, but it was the biggest house he'd ever sold. And it was the biggest verdict I'd ever had at the time. And so Scott and I remained friends all these years. I also have another interesting case that happened about the same time. I had a Corvette rollover, and there was a case of a guy that was driving a Corvette, coming home for a party at night, and a drunk sailor rear-ended him. On the freeway, he was going about 55 or 60, and this guy came out at about 80, hit him. And the car rolled over and went up an embankment and very slowly rolled over. And what happened is it crushed his head, and he ended up being a quadriplegic. So we had a design defect case against the Corvette on the basis that the roof of a roof crush. Now, this was in 1992. And nobody had ever tried a roof crush case. There weren't very many standards. So the case went very well. And I was trying against a hotshot trial lawyer that went all around the country trying these kinds of cases. And he tried 10 cases with quadriplegics. And I insisted on having my client, even though he was having a lot of trouble. He was an African-American guy. And I had him sitting in the court when I could. So the defense attorney comes up to me one time and he says, Gary, he says, I feel badly for your client. It's really not good practice for you to be having your client sit in the courtroom like this and hear this. It just doesn't work around. He says, I've tried 10 quadriplegic cases, and I've never seen anybody do that before. I said, well, how'd you do on those? He says, I won them all. I said, well, okay, well, I think I'll keep my client in the courtroom. So we ended up with a $6.3 million verdict, which was the biggest verdict against them. And ultimately they paid it off, but they fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. To his day, is still a dear friend of mine. And this was 30 years later. And he's living in a nice house. He's married. I went to his wife's funeral. So there's kind of these long-term relationships with people that you're helping. And they're big verdicts, but they're just like so many of your other people you've interviewed. It's about the clients. It's about the relationships. That's what it's about. It's not about the money. It's about the relationships.
What was the reason for you writing a book? Did you just get up one day and say, I need to write a book?
No. What happened is I started getting active in the State Trial Lawyers Association in 1986. And in that year, the president was a buddy of mine. And we had a big initiative on the ballot. It was the first initiative of any of the initiatives in any of the State Trial Lawyers Association. There was one in Florida at the same time. And what happened is we got our clock cleaned. We raised $5 million and we was nowhere near enough. And we lost joint and several liability in 1986. And so there was a lot of concern about what was going to happen in 88, because that would be the next year that they could bring in a proposition. And they were after us big time to go for no fault and a bunch of things like that. So we had a north-south deal. So every year, somebody from the South would be president, then the North. Well, it turned out the North was always in the even year, which means that we were always in the election years. So they came to me and they said, Gary, we need you to run for presidency. And I wasn't all that well known, but I said, fine. So we had a contested election. All these lawyers from Southern California backed me, and I won by about 60-40, but it was a contested election. And then by then we knew there was a big horizon of a bunch of insurance companies coming together to put no fault on the ballot and a bunch of other ones. And then they decided to put contingency fee limitation on the ballot, Prop 106. That would have limited our contingency fees to 10%. Now, we're dead meat if we were stuck with a 10% contingency. But fortunately for me, I started to get to president. It turns out that the guy that I lost said, wait a minute, you're not eligible to be president because you have to be an officer for a year, and you were sworn in on December 4th. And now you want to come back on the 3rd. So it was like 2 days off that I'd not been an officer for a year. And so he goes to some judge in Sacramento County, and they issued a temporary restraining order and said I couldn't be president anymore. And so we had to take that thing up and appeal. Fortunately, we got a reverse back. So then I launched into this year. And that was the year that I told you my mother died. She was in the middle of it. So I go through a very difficult year. And there's just all kinds of stress over this thing. And a lot of people were very angry at me. And we had jury consultants. And so when a 10% contingency for lawyers went on the ballot, how do you think that thing polled? 90%. Everybody, limited thing on lawyers' fees. How are we ever going to win that? But we used the same consultants that had been against us, Prop 86. We pulled it back together. We raised $15 million. And by a lot of really smart tactics, we slowly began to bring it down and knew that we had a chance of winning it. So when the election happened in November of 88, it was the same year that Dukakis was running for president and George Bush the first time. Insurance companies spent $170 million. They spent more money beating our initiatives than they did in the entire election across the whole country to try and put us out of business. And fortunately, we won it. It changed my life significantly. But what I'd seen, Chad, in the year that I'd been that president was this huge amount of stress because it was existential. People were going to lose their practices and they wanted to do different things. And you don't know what the hell you're doing. We need to, they were all trial lawyers. They all thought they could run this thing. And then we had a bunch of advertising lawyers that were not very popular. And we eventually, through a really smart move, got them to all go off the air and quit advertising because they were killing us in the public domain. But following that, to get to your point, I sat back the next year and I'd quit drinking. I was in a different path. And I'd seen so much stress and anger and frustration in my profession that I said, I'd like to start talking to lawyers about something different. Other than just how to win a case and how to try a case and no closing. I'd given every talk you wanted in terms of all that. So I decided to have a talk about how we deal with our stress in our life and how we can get balance in our lives and how we can take care of ourselves. And I think part of it was I wanted to tell my story about alcohol, and because, I'd seen a lot of lawyers really go down the drain with alcohol. So I started doing this, and I was going to a psychiatrist who was a pretty good guy, and he had a little publishing company, and he says, you got to tell your story. But I really wanted to talk about, not just about my life, but it was about my life as a lawyer and a trial lawyer. And I thought that by telling my story about my intervention, by telling my story about all my experiences, about talking about depression and stuff, that I could help people understand it and help them understand their own lives, help them deal with the stresses. And so I've gotten tremendous feedback from this little book I wrote. I was never in it to make money or to sell a lot of things, but reading it, you could also get your CLE credit in substance abuse. So I felt I wanted to tell my story, and in order to see if I could, I don't know if about the word trying to be a role model, but I felt that my story could help other people because I just came from humble roots and I'm not any better than anybody else. And a lot of lawyers have gotten a lot bigger verdicts. I made a lot more money than I have. But I'll tell you, very few lawyers have had more fun than I have been a trial lawyer. Very few.
You still go to trial and you've been doing this a long time. Any tips on getting older and dealing with getting older? And
well, yeah, that's if there's something we'd like to close with, it's the subject of aging. 20 years ago, I would never have thought that I should be trying cases at this time of my life. Melvin Belli got involved in the case in his 80s that he made an utter fool of himself. He was suing a well-known trial lawyer, Brown and Green, for legal malpractice, and he got all mixed up between the legal and the medical and made a fool of himself and lost the case. And I thought to myself, there's no fool like an old fool, like my mother would say, no fool like an old fool. And yet, as time went on, I began to realize, if you said, Gary, what do you think was the best day of your life? I have no doubt about it. It's my 60th birthday. We had a big party on my 60th birthday and had a big bash. 10 years later, we had a big party on my 70th birthday, and somebody coined the term, says 70 is the new 50. I love that. 70 is the new 50. That's me. So now 80 is the new 60, and that's the way I feel about it. Jimmy Carter at 90 was still out building houses and doing all that kind of stuff. And so age is a state of mind. If you say to yourself, Jesus, I really feel old, guess what? You are old. I listen to my music out of my 50s and my 60s. I think of myself, I remember these times. I still think of myself as a young guy. From May 1st, 1966 to today, if you took all the days that I took off work, probably less than a month, probably 3 weeks. So I've been very fortunate. Of course, I think sometimes I went to work when I was sick, but that was another story. But because I wasn't an athlete, I didn't get my joints all beat up. And I'm sure I've got a bad knee, but my back doesn't hurt, and I can walk pretty normally. And so I've been fortunate both physically, mentally, and most importantly, spiritually.
At Cloudlex, we understand the unique demands and opportunities that personal injury law firms face every day. That's why we've built a comprehensive platform designed exclusively for personal injury law. Our seamless case management, AI engine, litigation support, and record retrieval solutions empower you at every stage, from intake through settlement and beyond, helping you stay productive, organized, and focused on achieving successful outcomes for your clients. Explore what's possible at cloudlex.com. Now here is this episode's closing argument.
To be honest with you, I've kind of talked about it during this podcast. I'm a lawyer's lawyer. I think the thing that is important about my career is that I have helped other lawyers, and by helping them, they're helping their clients. I've done all that. But I've had the fortune to being in leadership in my career, and I've had an opportunity to be able to talk about things like my alcohol abuse and talk about that very honestly. I've talked about the stress of our profession, and I've talked about how we have to deal with our losses. I've talked about real things, real life. I've talked about my spiritual journey, and I've laid myself out there. But I've also reached out and connected with lawyers and trial lawyers. I love trial lawyers, and I'm a trial lawyer true and true. So I would have to say it's about what I can and have done to other trial lawyers, and I feel very fortunate that I've written this book, Getting a Winning Verdict in My Personal Life. A trial lawyer finds his soul. And it's my story that I hoped would find a little help for other people along the line. I'm nobody special. Anybody could have been where I am. I didn't have any background, and I'm not the smartest guy in the class. I haven't gotten the biggest verdicts. But I'll tell you, is there are very few lawyers who've enjoyed their career more and had more fun than I am. And so that's where I am. I'm a trial lawyer. And I'm going to stay a trial lawyer as long as I live and breathe.
That was trial lawyer Gary Gwilliam. Thanks for sharing your stories. To learn more about Gary, visit his firm's website, giccb.com. All right, I'm Chad Sands. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
You've been listening to Celebrating Justice, presented by Cloudlex and the Trial Lawyers Journal. Remember, the stories don't end here. Visit triallawyersjournal.com to become part of our community and keep the conversation going. And for a deeper dive into the tools that empower personal injury law firms, visit cloudlex.com/TLJ to learn more.